The Cultures of Tiki. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. Kurt Vonnegut from Mother Night. In 2015, while conducting research at the Aria in Las Vegas, I stumbled upon a surprising theme among many other themes inside a relatively unthemed casino. Nestled among the slot machines that featured an array of exotic representations of the past, culture, and branded entities, the Lord of the Rings, Amazonian princesses, cuddly pandas, among others, was the conspicuous game Tiki Beach by IGT. Like the other slots, Tiki Beach was designed to attract the potential player with its mesmerizing lights, cute cartoon characters, and promises of lucrative bonus games. But these features were not the facets of the slot machines that drew me to its surface. This was the first sighting that I had of a Tiki-themed slot machine, a fortuitous event as I was at that time trying to grasp the elusive nature of this cultural form. As I glanced more closely at the representations on the slot, it occurred to me that the surface symbols of the game reaffirmed my sensibilities about Tiki, a kitschy, less than serious, and now dated pop culture entity. Yet as I reflected more deeply at conceptual and meta levels, my senses of Tiki began to change. My mind began to focus on one of the iconic humanoid Tiki statues represented on the slot, and I started to obsess on one of the Tikis that was adorned with sunglasses. At first, it seemed to me that the sunglasses fit the representation in that Tiki has come to stand for a beach lifestyle, having eroded any of the semiotic and cultural foundations of Polynesian cultures, and now having landed in popular culture as a lifestyle, not unlike that of Jimmy Buffett, Parrot Heads, and Margaritaville. Yet, on second glance, it occurred to me that the sunglasses were somewhat blasphemous, as odd as this now sounds, in that they have taken the essences of Tiki and have transformed and remade them too excessive and extravagantly, such that the resonances of Tiki are now too diluted, the overall thematic complex of which is left, ironically, with near empty signifiers. The sunglass-wearing Tiki at once demonstrated to me the ascendancy of Tiki as a lifestyle form, and now its nadir. Reflecting today on my encounter with Tiki Beach, I struggle to answer a series of questions that not only informs the study of Tiki, but also speaks to paramount issues in the nature of theme spaces and themed living. Do material representations of Tiki, like the iconic American backyard Tiki bar, identify a new direction in the nature of themed and immersive space? Can any forms of Tiki be considered authentic given the fact of Tiki's illicit material and cultural borrowing? Are those associated with Tiki and its complex lifestyle politics guilty of forms of cultural essentialism and appropriation, of celebrating primitivism and an overall ethnocentric lack of appreciation of material, religious, and cultural forms which have given rise to such lifestyle? Is it possible to imagine Tiki as anything other than a joke, wink, or form of kitsch? This writing builds on ethnographic study of the cultures of Tiki that includes archival research, interviews with individuals enmeshed within Tiki culture, and research visits to a number of famous Tiki venues, including the revived Don the Beachcomber in Huntington Beach, California, the Tonga Room and Hurricane Bar in San Francisco, California, and Trader Vic's in Emeryville, California. The work begins with a focus on the material, cultural, and lifestyle essences of Tiki, with an emphasis on the idea of postmodern culture. It then addresses Tiki through the lens of culture sampling, or the ways in which Tiki represents the sampling and remixing of various cultures, lifestyles, and affective realms. It then focuses on the resonances of Tiki with an emphasis on the various material, performative, and lifestyle instances of Tiki, and is followed by a discussion of authenticity and kitsch. The writing concludes with the consideration of the dynamics of cultural appropriation and the ethics of Tiki lifestyle, especially in the context of numerous other examples of contemporary cultural appropriation in popular culture and the media, and the various related life worlds of lived theming such as Civil War reenactment and other thematic forms of lifestyle. A general concern of this research is to analyze tiki as a conceptual midpoint between the forms of theming and immersion common to contemporary themed spaces like theme parks and examples of lifestyle immersion or live theming found in reenactment and other avocational circles. The original image and its reflection. Among the cultures of the Maoris and of the islands of Polynesia, tiki, the first being and creator, is fashioned as an image, a tiki, which is a representation of the tiki in wooden sculptural form. In Maori culture, the tiki is often worn as a pendant, which is fashioned out of greenstone. Both of these indigenous meanings of tiki highlight the practice of the representation of cultural and cosmological orders and material and immaterial forms, a practice that is common to most cultures in the world, those indigenous and those popular. Representation and forms of remaking are always caught up in the very tricky politics of presumed origins and their dissemination. Tiki, in both its indigenous and popular forms, is no different. It is an entity that expresses the illicit nature of any form of remaking, yet it is the popular form of tiki that has most dramatically illustrated the stakes of representation and remaking, and which may, I will argue, provide fertile grounds on which to more fully consider the nature of theming in both architectural and lifestyle dimensions. According to tiki expert and Taschen author Sven Kirsten, whose numerous lavish and creative books on tiki have had a notable impact on the popular construction of what some have also called Polynesian pop, tiki took root in the 1940s as sailors returned from calls of duty in the Pacific. The work of popular author James Michener, particularly his Tales of the South Pacific and its later adaptation as the musical South Pacific, Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki Expedition, as well as his text, The Kon-Tiki Expedition by Raft Across the South Seas, and Aku Aku, The Secret of Easter Island, popular chain restaurants Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic's, Hawaiian statehood and associated tourism, television shows like Gilligan's Island, the music of Martin Denny and others connected to the exotica genre, the Enchanted Tiki Room ride at Disneyland, tiki-themed apartments and hotels and certain architectural style influences, such as A-frame design, and the ubiquitous backyard tiki bar, all of these are, according to Kirsten, notable foundations in the evolution of tiki as a form. As suggested with his list, a number of the influential moments in the evolution of tiki include architectural, material cultural, and decor elements, all of which situate tiki within the traditions of other themed and immersive spaces. Particularly famous spaces like those of themed restaurants, Don the Beachcomber and Trader Vic's, themed hotels, Caliente Tropics in Palm Springs, California, tiki apartments, the Tiki Apartments in Redondo Beach, themed casinos and tiki bars, the now closed Harvey's in South Lake Tahoe, California, and theme parks, Disneyland's Enchanted Tiki Room and the associated primitivism of Adventureland, the never fully realized tiki theme park of Danny Baltz, noted as or known as the Tikis. As all of these assisted in forging a new form of Polynesian pop design in the United States. Bamboo, rattan, and thatched structures and features, artwork depicting tropical paradise and various fauna, turtles, parrots, sea life, muted versions of the colors orange, brown, tan, red, and green, and numerous tiki statues were some of the many noticeable and distinctive styles of the tiki lexicon. Somewhat unique to tiki's evolution is the growth and popularity of the backyard tiki bar. In this example, tiki may be said to be one of the most popular choices of homeowners in the United States in terms of using an evocative theme by which to theme their home, or at least a part of it. Yet tiki as a cultural form is much more than any of these material details would suggest. For many people, tiki begins and ends with a few tiki torches, a couple of statues, and a tropical drink. But as I discovered visiting the International Tiki Marketplace at Don the Beachcomber in 2015, there are significant lifestyle components to Tiki as well. And again, here are some of the examples of some of the architectural decor and material cultural elements. And then here is a photo from my visit to Don the Beachcomber and the International Tiki Marketplace. My trip to the International Tiki Marketplace was necessitated by a desire to connect with the many individuals who are a part of a number of loosely knit communities, the cultures of Tiki, as I will call them. Cultures in the plural is used to connote two facets of the study. First is the tendency within cultural anthropology to regard the construct of culture as a multiplicity, as opposed to its once monolithic and all-encompassing definition. And second is the idea that Tiki represents the convergence of cultural forms, material, lifestyle, and ideational, that is characteristic of postmodern subcultures and avocational tendencies outside of the world of Tiki. My goal to study ethnographically the cultures of Tiki stems from an interest to move beyond Tiki's materiality and surface expressions, a somewhat ironical as I have discovered, and to better understand the avocational lifestyle and even existential expressions of its adherents. Samples of culture. One of the most interesting narrative currents that runs throughout the mini Sven Kirsten Tiki texts is the idea that Tiki is best studied from the perspective of an explorer, or more properly, an urban pop archaeologist or anthropologist who is willing to research strange and seemingly arcane rituals of those involved in Tiki culture. Kirsten's reliance on this narrative likely relates to his efforts to make his important text funny and more readable for his audience. But considered in a more conceptual light, the narrative of the ethnographer seeking out a strange and primitive culture has important implications for an overall understanding of Tiki's constructions. Otto von Stroheim offers a similar metaphor in an interview about Tiki. Quote, "You have to take Tiki at face value and run with it," end quote. For a cultural anthropologist, taking something at, quote, face value is an interesting proposition. Anthropologists have traditionally focused on the most in-depth, holistic, and even subterranean views of a given culture and its various phenomena. As Clifford Geertz once remarked, in terms of thick description, it is incumbent on the anthropologist to push beyond the surface meanings of cultural phenomena. As he famously wrote about in terms of the difference between a wink and a blink, there is much to be learned by delving deep into a culture, its people, and its meaning systems. The problem arises when we attempt to apply Geertz's interpretive framework to the case of Tiki. Were an anthropologist to do so, he or she would likely discover either what appears to be a lack of deep meaning, as Tiki seems to be deliberately residing on the surfaces of culture, winking at us all the while, or a sense of meaning that is imbued with all of the things that he or she, as an anthropologist, is patently against: cultural stereotyping, ethnocentrism, primitivism, and the like. The adherents of Tiki would likely admonish an anthropologist for first desiring to study the form, and then second, for any conclusions that might be critical of Tiki's core. The whole point of Tiki, as I heard time and time again in many field observations, is to eschew the serious and the conventional, and to delight in the campy and the controversial. During my time at the International Tiki Marketplace at Huntington Beach, California in 2015, I had the opportunity to speak to a number of the attendees of this quasi-conference. One of the initial questions that I posed to Tikophiles was, why did you get involved with Tiki? As one might expect, there was considerable variance in the responses that I received. Some saw Tiki as an expression of individuality. This was especially common among the sculptors and artisans. Others viewed it as an escape from everyday life, and some, quite interestingly, saw Tiki as some sort of spiritual calling. Such was the case with Von Tiki, a Tiki sculptor from Ventura, California. In his mind, quote, If tiki gives you a bunch of palm trees, you carve tikis, end quote. Von Tiki spoke of his aesthetic work as a devoted religious person might speak of his belief system. He told me that he used only traditional tools, but occasionally supplemented them with power ones. What I found interesting in his discussion of carving was the hybrid sense of authenticity that he expressed about his practices. As Ryan Moore has written of punk subcultural practices, the notion of authenticity that are often part of a subcultural's ethos can seem to the outsider to be contradictory in nature. I believe Von Tiki's sensibilities about his carvings suggest an awareness to maintain what he demonstrates to be traditional techniques, but also an ability to adapt, modify, and rework those techniques so as to create a new hybrid aesthetic. As well, due to Tiki's inherently constructed and overdetermined nature, carvers like Von Tiki ruminate on the discourse of authenticity as a means of balancing out the nature of Tiki. Like many forms of contemporary postmodern culture, Tiki, as a hybrid entity, represents a balancing act in terms of its playing with the politics of authenticity and culture. It is this playing with culture and winking at us at least a bit that gives Tiki its charm, as well as the outrage in the minds and views of social critics. During my conversations with Von Tiki, I became more and more aware of the playfulness inherent in the form. He explained that styles and movements that have very little or nothing to do with Tiki of the past, like surf culture and car culture, are now becoming a part of Tiki culture. In his mind, this was acceptable, but other variations of Tiki's remaking, such as, quote, a Chinese restaurant using Tiki to sell food, was a bastardization of the form, end quote. What seemed evident in Von Tiki's constructions of Tiki was that the choices of cultural mixing and remixing that are part of Tiki's world are highly personalized and adaptable to the individual and contexts at hand. In my time spent with Tiki adherents, I have felt a great sense of openness and non-judgment, and this may also explain this artist's openness to new and expanded versions of Tiki. As well, I would suggest that an acceptance of Tiki's adaptability and its constant redeployment as a cultural form illustrates Tiki's reliance on representations of culture. Tiki is, by its nature, a remade form. In fact, some critics have charged that it is too much a product of remaking and thus lacks authenticity or cultural sensitivity. I will address these critiques shortly, but let me argue that on the contrary, Tiki represents a manifestation of what I have called culture sampling, or the tendency to draw on or sample a culture for the purpose of recreating and remixing that culture or numerous variations of it in another place. Like the forms of theming common to consumer-themed spaces, the material and architectural expressions of Tiki rely on certain essences that connote the associations intended by Tikiphiles. The classic backyard Tiki bar, as I will consider later, is an example of a themed spatial form that is highly dependent on iconic, over-the-top, and even stereotypical colors, material, aesthetics, and narrative. Part of Tiki's pleasure relies on such material expressions for their inherent emotional import and effects, both internally and externally within straight or mainstream society. And in some ways, it shares affinities with Egyptomania. In addition to such forms of sampling in the material senses, we see that Tiki's other expressions, including its iconic exotica music, its social gatherings, and the origin myths detailed by its members, also follow a pattern of cultural sampling. Authenticity and the fake. One of the most enduring associations with that of Tiki is the notion of the fake and inauthenticity. The casual observer of the form would likely view Tiki as one would velvet Elvis paintings, garden gnomes, pink flamingo lawn art, colorful depictions of mystical unicorns, and any number of other items which have been labeled as kitsch. Tiki, with its garish colors, over-the-top caricatured sculptures, cheap bamboo bars and furniture, Martin Denny exotica music, conformist Hawaiian shirts and island sarongs, among other features, represents to such an antagonist the most base and lurid of popular culture forms. An aficionado of tiki, whether a person who enjoys her backyard tiki bar on the weekend or a more involved individual who follows tiki bulletin boards on the internet and who attends tiki conferences, is a person who suffers from inauthenticity in terms of her connection with culture. Or, in the words of Gilo Dorfels, whose attitude towards works of art is definitely and hopelessly wrong. As I have suggested throughout this work, many of the tiki aficionados with whom I spoke had little, if any, difficulty in terms of these claims of the forum's inauthenticity. My time at the International Tiki Marketplace reminded me of other cultural traditions, including those at Comic-Con and other fan conventions, in which humor, reappropriation, and strongly believing in oneself go hand in hand. At the tiki event, I noted one individual, depicted here, who was wearing a very garish and over-the-top tiki mask that would have certainly been welcomed at a fan convention like Comic-Con. The humor and constant winking at straight or non-tiki society is part of what gives the forum its social draw. In one of the most interesting depictions of the nature of tiki, Otto von Stroheim, a contemporary of Sven Kirsten and publisher of Tiki News, suggested that tiki is a cultural form that is in fact fake. As he said, quote, "Tiki is a culture in and of itself, not Polynesian, not island style or, say, Jimmy Buffett. It is anchored by tiki bars, which are fake representations of Polynesian islands here on the mainland," end quote. Other tiki aficionados also share von Stroheim's sense of tiki's fake nature. As one offered, he didn't want any authentic Polynesian artifacts in his tiki-themed spaces of home. Quote, "Those belong in the British Museum. I only want the fake stuff, the fake real stuff," end quote. Tiki's members are extremely comfortable with the forum's lack of fidelity. And again, there are parallels to be drawn between this spirit and that of punk. The difference is, of course, that punk has had an edgier, nihilistic, and countercultural spirit in terms of its reactions to those who disapprove of its core symbols, values, performances, and personal expressions. In my observations of similar tiki groups, I have heard only laughter and good wishes in the responses to any outsiders who might deem tiki to be inauthentic, fake, or even kitsch. The topic of kitsch is a particularly complex one that is covered in more depth in numerous excellent studies of popular culture. For purposes of this study, it is important to note a series of concerns that might be raised in terms of the assertions of critics who would likely challenge the inauthenticity of kitsch popular culture generally and tiki culture more specifically. For purposes of this study, it is important to note a series of concerns that might be raised in terms of the assertions of critics who would likely challenge the authenticity of kitsch popular culture generally and tiki culture more specifically. First, as sociologist Herbert Gans has written of taste publics and taste cultures, the distinctions between so-called high and low culture and their constituent determinants of taste have been greatly exaggerated. In fact, new research on contemporary popular culture suggests that more and more presumed high and low cultures are involved in forms of cross-fertilization and convergence. As well, as Gans further argues, high and low culture distinctions are born of particular social class dynamics which are often forgotten in discussions of kitsch and inauthenticity in popular culture. As I will consider later in comparisons of tiki culture to American and German reenactment subcultures, the reactions against those who favor tiki are discursively and politically representative of the rhetoric of class warfare and loathing disguised as the politics of taste. A third concern relates to the vacuous grounds of distinction on which kitsch rests. Present in the discourse of kitsch are universalistic claims of cultural superiority in which those who differentiate kitsch from high culture claim to be able to make such distinctions in the first place. claims which violate relativistic theories of popular culture that suggests that all taste cultures are of equal worth. As we noted earlier, we may look at how such self-identified, even celebrated forms of the fake may in fact promote stronger senses of group identity, community, or communities among members of the Tiki community. Anthropologist Daniel Miller, in a study of home cultures that predates his important The Comfort of Things, writes of an ethnographic study in which he interpreted the material object kitsch collections of one of his informants not as a matter of taste, but a means by which the individual could come to terms with tragedy, coming of age, loss, and feelings of existential insignificance. In my own ethnographic observations of Tiki communities, I noted a similar sense of comfort that was provided by Tiki material culture, performance, and lifestyle among individuals who, like the woman in Miller's study, were disinterested in external perceptions about Tiki's inauthenticity, phoniness, or kitsch quality. As my informant Von Tiki expressed in a discussion of his approach to Tiki carvings, quote, "When the Tiki bug bites you, then you get hooked," end quote. In his mind, participation in Tiki events was natural and certainly authentic in terms of the meanings of community, individualism, and aesthetic craft that are a part of his notions of Tiki. But this certainly begs the question, to what extent does Tiki's internal ethos impinge on those outside of its community? Cultural appropriation and the ethics of Tiki. In 2015, the story of Rachel Dolezal dominated the news. Dolezal was the chair of the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP and a part-time instructor at Eastern Washington University. And it was discovered that she had fabricated numerous details of her life history in order to claim African American ancestry. Dolezal was interviewed on numerous major media programs, and even when confronted with clear evidence of her European American ancestry, she maintained her identity as being African American. A number of Dolezal's critics suggested that by making her claims that she had culturally, politically, even existentially appropriated aspects of the African American experience. The Dolezal case is certainly not the first and will not be the last example of the complex politics of cultural appropriation. Within the world of popular music, the rapper and former model Iggy Azalea has raised similar concerns about the ethics of appropriating other aesthetic and cultural styles. Azalea's signature is her uncanny recreation of Southern African American female voice in her rapping performances. Many have called the signature style, as well as music videos that depict the rapper in potentially culturally insensitive contexts, such as the Bollywood-styled India in Bounce. Many have called this signature style inappropriate cultural appropriation, even blackface. Tiki as a cultural form is no stranger to the world of cultural appropriation. Tiki, particularly in reference to its primitivistic roots and its sampling of Polynesian cultures, has been interpreted as a form that is inherently problematic for its reliance on cultural appropriation. Especially troubling for those who have studied Tiki, Polynesian pop, and other related forms is the common reliance on the savage slut, the figure of the primitive indigenous person and her culture appropriated for Western cultural and aesthetic forms. All forms of theming, including Tiki, entail such forms of appropriation. Like earlier examples of cultural appropriation common to the art of Gauguin, Picasso, and Van Gogh, Tiki's drawing on Polynesian and Pacific cultures suggests problematic constructs and foundations related to colonialism, racism, sexism, among other issues. As George Lewis has suggested, cultural appropriation is much more about the reframing of dreams and desires of the appropriating culture than it is a form of homage to that culture. One of the most curious facets of Tiki is the fact that so many of its proponents are willing to address this aspect of the cultural form. In one interview about Tiki parties, Tiki News magazine publisher Otto von Stroheim calls Tiki forms, quote, fake representations of Polynesian islands here on the mainland, end quote. In a similar vein, heralded exotica composer and musician Martin Denny described his music, which has become highly associated with tiki, as a construct. Quote, "My music is fictional, but it's based on different ethnic sounds and instruments. It was sort of all a make-believe type of thing, fiction. It's what people think the islands might be like in your own mind," end quote. Of course, these admissions do not necessarily justify the representations that are characteristics of forms of Polynesian pop culture. What they do suggest, like the Dolezal and Azalea cases, is a certain postmodern hybridity that has come to characterize much of contemporary popular and public culture. Especially in the world of signification's endless deferral, as Jacques Derrida has offered, it becomes incredibly challenging to make sense of original, copies, sources, and citation. Tiki's problem, and simultaneously its draw, is its loose and carefree approach to cultural appropriation. Its adherents admit fully to Tiki's lack of authenticity, using the term of the mainstream and its critics, accept its playful recombinatory notions of cultural forms, and feel delight in an apolitical response to those who critique Tiki's problematic connections to cultural appropriation. One analysis of Tiki conducted in 2014 suggested that the form's easy and carefree drawing on culture was no more a given. Quote, "A growing sensitivity to the poor treatment of indigenous people made many uncomfortable with the idea of drinking from a glass shaped like a native girl," end quote. The stereotypical women depicted in Tiki culture suggest a related issue of the ethics of cultural appropriation. In addition to Tiki's problematic connections to primitivism and racial essentialism, there is the issue of its constructions of gender and sexuality. Don Beach, born Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant, is best known for his successful Don the Beachcomber restaurants and bars, but many see him, along with Vic Bergeron of Trader Vic's, as the primogenitor of the Tiki movement. Many other males appear in the pages of Sven Kirsten's numerous Tiki books, along with numerous scantily clad or nude women, some of whom are women of color. It could be said that much of the aesthetic of Tiki is a male-centered one, with emphasis placed on the male, relaxed on a beach and sipping a tropical drink, while beautiful women walk by. As Amy Stillman writes, Tiki culture identifies with the figure of the white male beachcomber living in paradise, whose object of desire is an exotic, brown-skinned island girl. Interestingly, many of Tiki's founders suggested that Tiki emerged in the 1950s as a response to sexual puritanism in the United States. As Kirsten relates, quote, "With Tiki, the generation of our parents, for the first time, were ridding themselves of the Christian heritage of Puritanism," end quote. Of course, in cases like these, a subculture's attempt to escape sexual Puritanism or the other mores of society does not necessarily result in equality among its members. In this sense, subcultures like those of Tiki exist between the unease of social criticism and the suggestions of social change fueled by its members and their values. Tiki has not been characterized as a new social movement, and certainly not an alternative or redemptive social movement that seeks to either change behaviors of people or society itself. Its existence as a subculture that specifically has a checkered history in terms of its drawing on cultural appropriation and heteronormativity has resulted, in the minds of some critics, as a force counterproductive to other social movements that may have intentions of social change. Lisa Hall describes such a situation in reference to Tiki and other forms of pop Hawaiianness. The touristic representations common in Hawaii, for example, have, quote, "significant political implications because by making Hawaiianness seem ridiculous, kitsch functions to undermine sovereignty struggles in a very fundamental way. Bombarded with such kitsch, along with images of leisure and paradise, non-Hawaiians fail to take Hawaiian sovereignty seriously, and Hawaiian activism remains invisible to the mainstream," end quote. Postmodern subcultures and backyard tiki bars. For many individuals, including those who enjoy tiki but who do not share as much passion for it as someone like Von Tiki, the idea that tiki could be connected to the politics of cultural appropriation, colonialism, and heteronormativity would likely never enter the person's consciousness. Instead, he or she would likely be too caught up in the milieu of fruity island drinks, rattan furniture, and kitschy tikis that make up his or her backyard tiki bar. Of all of the connotations that people have of tiki, it is the tiki bar, whether the backyard or the public establishment variety, that holds the strongest meanings. The internet is flooded with how-to guides that describe the themes, techniques, and materials needed to create a tiki bar. The DIY, do-it-yourself cosmology of tiki, which I have noted in my conversations with adherents in numerous spaces, certainly offers a proletarian spirit that is part of its appeal. As more notes of punk subcultures, the DIY spirit holds a special legacy for many subcultures. What is curious in the case of Polynesian pop is that the very openness and non-serious spirit that may attract a newcomer to the subculture is also the ethos that may suggest to the same person that tiki is not exclusive in that anyone can be a part of it. As Dick Hebdish and others have written of other subcultures, the contradictory spirit of tiki is part and parcel of its notable cultural manifestations. And perhaps this open appeal to be a popular form, as Sven Kirsten once said, tiki, quote, emerged from the common subconscious, end quote, has led to its untimely transformation. Numerous tiki businesses like this one here on the internet suggest a gradual movement of the form beyond its Polynesian pop roots. In this case and other examples, one notes pirate and parrot head Jimmy Buffett merchandise being sold on the website. As well as illustrated in Von Tiki's narratives of the form, tiki aficionados would not necessarily chastise an individual for drawing on Jimmy Buffett iconography in his or her own construction of tiki. Doing so, it would seem, would go against the openness and tolerance that seem to characterize the ethos of the cultural form. At the same time, within tiki's diehard community, there is some admonishment given to the individual who wishes to create his or her backyard themed space while taking too many liberties with it. In the mind of Sven Kirsten, quote, do not use parrots or monkeys or pirate stuff. Nautical, yes. Asian, some. Mexican, never. Remember, first and foremost, the culture is about the Polynesian Triangle, the South Seas or South Pacific, end quote. Interestingly and quite telling for this study is the fact that Kirsten's admonishment comes not from the pages of one of his tiki tomes, but from the piece How to Go Tiki, written by the paint company Dunn Edwards. The author, Kastel Wasserman, produced a very interesting series of features on tiki subculture, including emphases on major tiki gatherings like Tiki Caliente in Palm Springs, California, famous artists like Shag, and the many connections of tiki to material culture. Quite obviously, the focus of Dunn Edwards is on paint colors, decor, and design. The company has a series of paints that they recommend were a typical person to create his or her own backyard tiki bar. These include Tiki Torch, DE5453, and Bamboo Screen, DE6193. These articles, which are incredibly interesting in their own right in terms of how they detail the connection of the paint industry to themed spaces, reflect some of tiki's core principles, notably the emphasis on humor and campiness. At other levels, however, the writing parallels other industry consumer guides to tiki that seem to high culture tiki up a bit. An article written on the subject in Essence magazine suggests a variety of Polynesian-style items that would be appropriate for a backyard tiki party, while Martha Stewart Living offers an upscale chic look at tiki by suggesting that first-timers focus on sophisticated material culture and culinary cues, like leaf-covered candle holders, tropical fruit centerpieces, Hawaiian flower cushions, banana party cones, pineapple decoupage votives, grilled tuna skewers, and many other items. The same tone of sophistication has been applied to the ubiquitous tiki drink, including the zombie, scorpion, and Mai Tai, with claims that the, quote, faux Polynesian aesthetic of tiki came off as phony, end quote. And there is a need to remake the signature tiki cocktail into something much more refined. Not all of the calls to remake tiki are based on high culture arguments or a desire to focus on tiki's materiality. To return to cultural appropriation, we see that numerous critics have called for stylistic changes in tiki's core foundations in order to make room for more authenticity in tourism in Hawaii and Polynesian cultures. The curious thing will be to assess to what degree tiki can maintain the spirit that drives its most diehard followers to attend conventions like those described in this writing, and also link its relevance to the larger culture. Of course, this last idea may belie its intentions of maintaining a postmodern locus as a subculture. The play of culture, theme space, theme living, and identity. Throughout my research, I have discovered that tiki, in line with other forms of theming, is very commonly only understood through its material manifestations, the fruity drinks, the thatch bars, and the eponymous statues. In other work, I have suggested that theming is much more than an architectural or material culture approach to the world. It is a catalyst for social interaction and communities, a performative practice, even an existential state. During my years as a trainer in the theme spaces of Six Flags Astroworld in Houston, Texas, I became more and more attached to forms that I called lived theming, or the ways in which material expressions of theming are internalized by individuals in numerous ways. In the case of tiki, it is very unfortunate that few people ever stop and ask, what does tiki mean to the aficionado? Or how does tiki provide meaning to an individual in an otherwise chaotic world? Instead, the emphasis on the form is a reductionistic one with little attention to these phenomenological and existential concerns. To the outsider, it may sound silly to speak of existential issues in the same context of tiki, but this is exactly what is needed. Earlier, I wrote of the disturbance that resulted from my viewing of a tiki wearing sunglasses at a Las Vegas casino. My feeling came on the heels of extensive research in tiki's communities, and upon the occasion of seeing this image in Las Vegas, I could only imagine that all of the subcultural, existential, and countercultural spirits that are present in tiki will only be consumed by the popular forces that surround it, a fate not disconnected from the churning of cool hunting in the world. As is the case with the material elements considered in tiki cultures, the ideational foundations, the existential, political, and ideological cues that form the ethos of tiki also bespeak of tiki's postmodern form. The play of tiki in terms of culture suggests the meanings of process, as in tiki is always on the move, and of frolic, humor, and jubilation, as in tiki is a form that exists on the margins of serious culture. Not unlike the famous tiki bar, much in quotes, Sip and Dip in Great Falls, Montana, pictured here, which combines tiki decor with live performing mermaids, the ethos of tiki is quite deliberately contradictory. Some of its followers speak of its message of sexual freedom, fun, and a carefree lifestyle as a countercultural statement. Sven Kirsten once said that tiki represented, quote, a symbolic rebellion for the man in the gray flannel suit and the escape from his rigid lifestyle, end quote. Others have suggested something quite the opposite, with tiki framed as a just want to have fun movement, nothing more. Contemporary theorists of culture and subcultures would say that such contradictions are not surprising given the fact of the nature of hybridity and flow in the modern world. As Michel Mefasoli has written, elective affinity groups are characteristic of contemporary society. They are groups not unlike tribes, those entities of classic anthropology, yet they are organized, quote, as a plural series of affinities, end quote. Tiki's followers, not unlike those of themed reenactment and themed lifestyle communities, use Tiki's iconic material and ideational forms to orient themselves in the world that often appears to be contradictory to the feelings that tie them to their movement. In common with Indianness or individuals who thematically represent Native American cultures, is Tiki's claiming of a certain authenticity in the face of outsiders' belittling discourse of inauthenticity, fakes, and kitsch. Tiki also shares with other groups, such as those described in Anya Dresky's ethnographic documentary, De Stema van Kon, The Tribes of Cologne, in which the use of theme material culture, costume, architecture, performance, and games to create a lifestyle orientation suggests a playing with culture or playing ethnology, as Dresky says. The use of certain indigenous cultural foundations and forms of remaking suggests, on the one hand, a playful, creative, and expressive identity on the part of the user, and quite problematically on the other, an identity that is formed without enough attention given to the consequences of the remaking. Specific to reenactment communities is the growing suggestion that certain forms of reenactment and remade identity constructions not take place, thus confirming, as Stephen Gapps writes, the fact that the act of reenactment exists on the knife edge of the ethics of the appropriate and the politics of the inappropriate in terms of competing communities. Tiki's attractiveness is related to its inherently postmodern form. For its followers, it is apolitical, lacking the controversies inherent in Civil War reenactment circles. It is lifestyle-focused, being a culture of entertainment, enjoyment, and nonchalance, and it is deliberately irreverent, sharing in common with goth, Renaissance fair enthusiasts, and other subcultures the Rabelaisian pleasures of not caring all that much, as one person expressed to me. Tiki's failure lies not in its soft misogyny, cultural appropriation, and essentialism, or its willingness to align itself with the all-too-popular, kitschy, or campy forms of culture, but in its inability to act on the nascent counterinsurgency that is evident within its cultures. Concerns with Victorian sexuality and unrealistic expectations of masculinity could be addressed with new expressions of gender and sexuality, perhaps paralleling the metrosexuality and pansexuality trends outside of Tiki cultures, as well as with more critical reflections on gender, sexuality, race, and other intersectional and post-colonial issues. The desire to play with cultures in the plural, hybrid, and recombinant sense could be expressed with deeper reflections on the politics of appropriation, which might result in the opening up of forms of cultural dialogue and intercultural communication. The attractiveness of overtly popular and even kitschy forms of culture could be met with a more critical and postmodern spirit that could challenge politically the forms of elitism and high culture that make up much of United States public and popular cultures, a parallel with groups like the Tribes of Cologne, goth, and punk subcultures that illustrates, at least on one level, the desirability of challenging the status quo, of adopting and reformulating the mass hegemonic popular cultures of elites and corporations, and of celebrating politically the material markers, expressions, and lifestyles of, quote, bad taste. Of course, a Tiki aficionado would say that none of these expressions of response to the failures that I have identified are true reflections of Tiki. But then again, what is Tiki? Thank you very much.